Good morning. Welcome to the 10th meeting of the committee in 2014. Can I ask everyone to ensure that they have switched off mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please? Agenda item 1 today is an oral evidence session on the Disabled Persons Parking Badges Scotland Bill. I'd like to welcome our panel this morning, the Minister for Transport and Veterans, Keith Brown, the Member in charge of the bill, Dennis Robertson, Jill Mulholland, Head of Transport, Accessibility and Road Safety at Transport Scotland, Sharon Grant, the Bill Manager at Transport Scotland, and Stuart Feibister, Divisional Solicitor, Legal Director at the Scottish Government. Welcome and good morning. Minister, would you like to make any opening remarks, please?
If I could do briefly, Convener, thanks very much. Just really to set the context for the piece of legislation that we're discussing, the Blue Badge scheme itself is an important parking concession which enables improved mobility and therefore accessibility for disabled people. We have around 245,000 badges in circulation in Scotland, and it's my intention to try and ensure that the scheme remains fit for that important purpose. In the last 4 years, Transport Scotland has been working closely with agencies and third sector groups to make sure that the scheme is easier to access and used by those who are eligible, also that it's easier to enforce and more efficient to administer. So the reforms that we've had so far have included clarifying the eligibility criteria, introducing independent mobility assessments undertaken by occupational therapists, a redesign of the badge, making it harder to tamper with or to forge, and also introducing a UK-wide database of badge holders, which should be fully populated by the end of 2014, and that will allow up-to-date information to be held by local authorities. I support Dennis Robertson's bill, which complements the recent reform programme, and Transport Scotland officials have been working with Dennis to develop the bill. Two multi-agency groups, which include local authority staff and disability representative groups, are also working with Dennis to develop the important guidance and the content of the regulations to underpin the bill. I think it's worth stating that misuse of the badge is a problem. I receive complaints from the public about the misuse by third parties of the Blue Badge scheme. And recent Transport Scotland research, which interviewed around 800 Blue Badge holders, concluded that badge holders value the concessions provided by the Blue Badge. However, many had, in fact I think a majority had reported that they had experienced misuse of the Blue Badge. And the bill responds to the views of Blue Badge holders by enhancing the existing powers that we have to enforce the scheme. It also helps to send out the message that Blue Badge misuse is socially unacceptable. The relevant provisions of the bill are strong preventative measures, and those powers do not seek to catch more abusers, but rather to discourage and prevent abuse of the system in the first place, thereby saving time and money for enforcement agencies, and crucially freeing up spaces to be used by Blue Badge holders. I'm also pleased that the bill will further strengthen the scheme by providing a process which will allow people who have been refused a Blue Badge on grounds of eligibility to request a review of that decision, providing a more consistent and fair approach across the country. The bill is about on-street parking, as this is the area which the wider legislation of the Blue Badge scheme covers. However, I'm also aware of the frustrations from Blue Badge holders of misuse of disabled parking spaces in private car parks, such as those owned by large retailers. And members of the Scottish Retail Consortium are aware of the issues faced by disabled people, and some take action to encourage patrons to park sensibly. Although the Scottish Government itself has no jurisdiction to legislate in this area, I believe that Dennis Robertson's bill will raise awareness and encourage private owners to emphasise that disabled parking bays should be left for those who need them. And raising awareness of the Blue Badge scheme is something that came through strongly in the Transport Scotland research and from Dennis's consultation on the bill. And this is something I'd like to address, and officials are working with multi-agency groups to identify how messages about the purpose and the do's and don'ts of the scheme get to badge holders and to the public and to those responsible for enforcement of the scheme. There's already quite a substantial amount of guidance out there, but I believe that messages need to be distilled and simplified so that badge owners understand how their badges should be used. Enforcement officers also have to understand the sensitivities required in carrying out their duties, and the general public, of course, have to understand that this is not a victimless crime. Of course, I will ensure that the changes resulting from the bill are publicised in advance of introduction of the powers. And as I said previously, the legislation is not about catching more people abusing the system. It's about making people think about proper use of the badge, making people aware of the consequences of misusing Blue Badge parking spaces, and discouraging and preventing systematic abuse of the scheme. The clear aim is to send a strong message that abuse of the Blue Badge scheme will not be tolerated and that the rights of the Blue Badge holder to use the concession to access their work, leisure and support services are upheld. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Mr Robertson, do you want to make any opening remarks, please?
Very briefly, Convener, as the Minister's given a fairly full and comprehensive opening statement, can I just reiterate that the aim of the bill is to improve and support the aspect of the enforcement around the Blue Badge, and because we have the evidence to suggest that Blue Badges are being misused in a fairly grand scale at the moment, we need to be able to tackle this issue. Can I just say that I am grateful to the Minister and to the Government for supporting the bill, and my gratitude also goes to the Transport Scotland who have been supporting me in taking this bill forward. Having read the report from last week's evidence session, I look forward to the questions from members today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr Robertson, you said there misuse on a grand scale, and I think that some members were taken aback last week at the evidence given by Mr Catchlove of the City of Edinburgh, where he reckoned that 52% to 80% of the badges out there in any day are being misused. I wonder if I could ask Mr Robertson first, is this the kind of thing that you have found to be the case as you have been gathering up evidence in terms of bringing this proposed bill forward?
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I mean, certainly from the evidence we've had and from the consultation that has come in, that is one of the areas that the Blue Badge holders themselves are concerned about, is the absolute misuse. Now, sometimes this misuse is down to fraudulent misuse. It's sometimes down to a third-party misuse. And quite often this third-party misuse is without the knowledge of the Blue Badge holder themselves. And I think the evidence last week from Mr Catchlaw actually is probably fairly significant in urban areas, maybe not so much in rural areas. But I think Dundee carried out a similar scheme, and again the results were quite staggering. I think the official report, Convener, might say it was 52 to 70% that Mr Catchlaw said. I stand to be corrected if it's not 80%. You're right, Clark's already corrected me. A slip of the tongue there, Mr Robertson. You're dead right, though. Are you finished? Yes.
Minister, do you have any comment on that particular scenario?
Another point to say that the 52% figure also is the same figure of the percentage of Blue Badge holders who believe they've experienced abuse of the system. So it's obviously a very real problem, and that's why Dennis has brought these things forward.
Thank you very much. Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's a question to Dennis Robertson. Just that you mentioned there regarding urban and rural. Are you aware of any marked difference in terms of the level of misuse between urban and rural communities?
I think the situation for Blue Badge holders themselves in trying to gain access to spaces is the same in both urban and rural. Obviously, within the urban areas, it's exacerbated because of the number of cars and vehicles looking at a limited number of spaces. I think it's worth saying, Convener, that this is not just about designated Blue Badge spaces within areas, whether it be urban or rural. It's about on-street parking as well, because the Blue Badge concession does enable a person with a Blue Badge to park on single and double yellow lines where there's no restrictions. So really, I think the problem is the same regardless. But and certainly from my own constituency perspective, my own mailbag is quite full sometimes with people contacting me about the misuse within rural settings.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anna Taggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. My question would be to the panel, what do you think is the solution to reducing and eliminating fraudulent misuse of the Blue Badges, given that it is a high percentage, 52 to 70%?
Mr Robertson, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Convener. I think raising the awareness is probably one of the answers around this. I mean, the legislation that we're proposing taking forward, I think, will assist with regard to increasing enforcement powers. But I think a lot of it is about education and awareness. And that's education of the blue badge holders themselves, and again, education within the public at large as to, you know, what constitutes the right of a person to use the blue badge. And again, and I'm sure most people, convener, would probably have seen the misuse of blue badge spaces on whether it be in private or local authority spaces. So it is a huge problem, and I think it is awareness. And we intend, within the guidance, within the bill, to raise that awareness, and we will be having an awareness launch campaign when we actually when the bill goes through. And I think with the third sector organisations, they're actually asking us to produce a fairly concise script, I think, for people with blue badges. Because at the moment it's quite complicated. People get a booklet, and the booklet is probably too large and has far too much information, I think, in it. Although it is pertinent, convener, I think we probably need some bullet point information for blue badge users themselves. And that in itself, I think, will reduce the misuse.
Minister?
Yes, I think I would agree with what Dennis has said about the public awareness raising being essential to improving or eliminating the abuse. But the other part is, of course, the teeth which are involved in the provisions of the bill which Dennis is bringing forward. So providing those necessary powers so that local authorities can tackle the problem. And, of course, we leave it to them to say how they want to do that. But and it may be the case that some experience it to a greater extent than others. Edinburgh we mentioned already. So they might want to take full use of the powers which are made available by this bill. So I think it's a combination of both. Raising the awareness means that there should be less, certainly inadvertent abuse, and also the people, if they're aware of the fact of these enforcement powers, along with some of the previous reforms that we've made of the system, it should mean that there's much less inclination to abuse the system, and also that people are aware that if they do, then there's a real possibility that they'll be brought to account for it.
Okay. I wonder, in terms of the mention of the booklet, there was a suggestion last week that maybe blue badge holders should sign for the booklet and the badge and say that they have read the booklet, or they will read the booklet and will stick to what it says. Now, Mr Robertson says that booklet is extremely large, and I have to be honest and say that I haven't seen it myself. Is there a way, Dennis, obviously you talked about a shortened version, is there a way to get this across in other ways and means, a little DVD or something which folk are more likely to have a look at rather than reading a massive booklet? The officers are free to come in, Ms Grant, if you want to say something there.
The application form itself actually requires the person, when signing the application, there's a declaration that they will read the booklet and abide by the rules of the scheme. So at the point of making the application for the badge, there are a number of declarations that the person has to make, and one of them is to read and abide by the rules of the scheme. So that's a first step, at least, to giving badge holders some, asking them to take some responsibility for the scheme.
You make a very valid point, though, convener. I think in respect of trying to ensure that the information is accessible to everyone in a format that is readily understood. It's maybe something we could look at in terms of production of something like a DVD or an audible version, to ensure that what is there is presented in a concise manner, and again can just sort of look at the main aspects of using a blue badge. So that's perhaps something we can take back to the working groups and look at the feasibility of producing something like that. We've got to ensure that the information does get out there in the appropriate format to the blue badge holders.
Thank you. I think the other thing, in terms of what Ms Grant says there, if I was applying and signing and saying that I would abide by the booklet, by the time I got the blue badge, I'd probably have forgotten that I'd signed the application form saying that I would read the booklet. Whereas if it was done when you got the badge and the booklet, it may be helpful. And I wonder if that could be looked at. Grant, thank you. I'm saying a nod of a head. Alec Rowley, please.
Thanks. Good morning. I think what's come across very clear is that there is widespread support for this bill. There's nobody jumping up and down and saying this is a bad thing. But the evidence last week really focusing on enforcement, and for the user's perspective, there was a view that there is little in terms of enforcement out there, either in terms of the blue badge and its misuse, or the misuse and abuse of parking bays themselves. And I just wonder really how that is to be addressed, and whether this bill in itself will simply, by bringing in the legislation for local authorities to have those powers, whether that in itself will actually work. I tend to liken it a bit to when as a young driver, the seat belts and the compulsory seat belt came in. And initially people weren't doing it until they realised that if you didn't buckle up, you were certainly going to be stopped and fined for breaking the law. And that was the key bit of evidence last week for me, is that what people were really saying, that were given evidence from organisations representing disabled groups, where their members predominantly have blue badges. One organisation, 80% of their members have blue badges. Their perception is that nobody really bothers at the end of the day. And if that's the perception of those who are abusing the system, in this case the blue badge, then will anything really change?
Minister?
I think that's the whole purpose of the bill, to try and affect that change. And, you know, also previous reforms like making sure that the blue badge, the actual design of the blue badge, is much less susceptible to being fraudulently replicated. The database which is now there helps to address that. And many of the people that hold, in fact the vast majority of people that hold blue badges, are aware of these previous reforms. And many, certainly of the groups, and I would suggest many of the individuals, are aware of the progress of this bill. And I think it does, I think you're right to say there's perhaps been a feeling there's a bit of laxity about the system so far, but I think the groups that I've talked to, not nearly as much as Dennis has done, are aware of this. But I do think you're right to say as well, it's partly to do with, if you think back to the seatbelt and also drink driving as well, it became peer pressure and social pressure on people that made them comply, almost more than the legal remedies which were there. And I think it goes back to the convener's previous point about how we get this message out. Now, we undertake social marketing in relation, for example, to, in particular, the dangers of rural roads. We've done one recently on the need for parents when they're driving to demonstrate good behaviour, because the very first time a child, whatever age, goes into a car, they start to learn about behaviours in cars. So we undertake these social marketing exercises. And it just occurred to me when the convener asked the previous question whether we might want to look, once this bill has progressed through, at what social marketing we can do to make it more socially unacceptable for people to abuse blue badges. But notwithstanding that, I think the bill itself, and Dennis held a launch for the bill at the start, with all the groups that were involved there, it was pretty well covered in the media. I think the message is starting to get out there that we are treating this more seriously. And what we're doing with this bill is enabling local authorities to do things which they might want to do to make it more serious if they see it as a problem as well.
Yeah, I think. Thank you very much, Convener. I think from an enforcement perspective, I mean, the purpose of the bill is to ensure that we're actually widening the scope of the enforcement. Because at the moment, Mr Rowley, what happens is that a parking attendant, for instance, can maybe look at a badge, have a look at it and say, well, I don't believe you're maybe the blue badge holder, but he can't confiscate. So the person can actually just drive off and retain that badge. So at the moment, you know, there is only limited powers of confiscation, and that is only to the police. So the scope of this bill will actually widen that area. So I think it probably will actually give an opportunity to enforce it much more widely than has at present. Because I think the limited powers, there's a reluctance maybe, I think, to go forward, given that, as I say, there's very little could be done in terms of maybe a confiscation of the badge, for instance, if they thought that the person wasn't the badge holder.
Rowley?
Following that up then, in terms of the actual resources and the follow-up of resources, because this will really be down to each local authority in terms of resources, and that question that was asked earlier about rural and urban, I would assume that you will find that in authorities where parking charges generally bring in significant resources, i.e. the cities in particular, you will find a lot more attendance, parking attendance, a lot more people that are enforcing. But in local authorities, particularly in the rural areas where there is very little parking charges, and so is there a danger that we're going to have a spread across Scotland, and more in particular, what is the role of the police? Do you still see the police, even though the traffic wardens are being removed, do you still see the police as having a significant role to play? Because coming back to my earlier point about seat belts, now people just generally belt up, and I accept part of that might be the social acceptability, but we're seeing it right now with people using phones in cars. The police are having to enforce that, and eventually that might come the same way. So does the police still have a significant role to play here in enforcement?
Yes, they do. They still have the same powers as before. Of course, the bill would extend that power because it creates a new criminal act, which is not just misuse of the badge, which is currently a criminal act, but the use of a cancelled badge. So the police would still have those powers, and you're right, it will be different fits in different areas. I think that's, to me, that's exactly right. It should be proportionate to what the local authority themselves believe the problem to be. And you're right to say, for example, in Edinburgh, I think the cost could be around £6,000 a year if one person misused a blue badge and took up a space he would otherwise have to pay for that entire year. So that will be significant to, say, Edinburgh City Council, and they might well find it, I assume they will find it, a good idea to make sure they put resources into maintaining that income which comes in and making sure that they drive down abuse. But I think it's right that it's, if you like, an enabling power, so that local authorities can say in their own area, this is not such a big problem for us, or it might not justify that additional expenditure. We believe we're already covered by whatever provision we have, as well as by the police at the same time. So I think it's right to do it in that way, rather than for us to prescribe, whether it was the establishment of a new set of enforcement officers or other things. I think it's entirely right that local authorities should take this forward themselves. And you're right, in my area, there is, I think, in the town centre of Alloa, there's no there's no pay-for parking provision, and very few regulations in terms of where you can park, other than the obvious ones, WL lines and so on. So it's going to be different for different areas, but I think that's the right way to do it. So the local authorities are the ones that will decide what resources to commit to it, and they'll do that on the basis of what they think the current situation is for them, whether it's, as with Edinburgh, lots of people coming from out with Edinburgh and coming into Edinburgh, and also the costs and the pressure on parking spaces. So I think it's right and it's proportionate that we do it in this way.
Thank you, Convener. I think from last week's evidence, Mr. Rowley, I think it was Assistant Chief Constable Lawson that had actually stated that yes, the police would be enforcing this, and they were committed to this. So the police are right behind this, and will continue to be. And I think this is, again, is just raising the awareness amongst officers themselves. And I'm sure that the Police Scotland will actually continue to do this.
Cameron Buchanan, please.
Thank you. I declare an interest in that I'm a blue badge holder. So I just wanted to say, I agree, first of all, about the booklet being too large. It comes out before you get the blue badge, so it is not really ready. You get the blue badge, you put it on the car and you go. So I think it should be one piece of paper with just the salient points. I mean, you can have the booklet, but the salient points on it, as Mr. Robertson said, just the 5 or 6 points that is very important. The other point I wanted to mention is it's not the same everywhere. When I was in London recently, I just had the blue badge, and Westminster does not have the same thing. You have to put a time clock if you're on a single yellow line. You have to pay if it's in a parking meter, and that should be made obvious. It is the same place everywhere in Scotland, is it? Does everybody have the same rules, i.e. single yellow lines? And that was the question I was really going to ask.
Minister? Yes, it's the same across Scotland, and because it happens to be different elsewhere, I think you're right to say we have to make sure that people are aware of the fact that if they travel to London it might be different, but it's not the case that we should, or that they should mimic what we do here. But I think across Scotland it is a situation, it's the same for all areas of Scotland. And the first point you made about the booklet, all I would say is Dennis has said himself that he's willing to give us further consideration. We will do so too, especially at the point where we're looking to raise awareness. We'll look at how best that can be done, whether it's a DVD idea, improving the booklet, or even some social marketing exercises.
It's just got to be kept simple, in my opinion. And also, I wonder if on that piece of paper it could be said, these rules only apply to Scotland, because I mean, you don't have to say where all the rules are, but abroad, for example, I mean, they have that EEEC thing on it, which says it's abroad. But we all know that abroad it's going to be different. But we don't necessarily, when we go down to Carlisle or Westminster, well, Carlisle's the same as us, but I mean, Westminster is completely different. It's up to, as you say, local authorities. And I think that should be maybe emphasised on the blue badge. Also, my other point was the fraud. There's quite a lot of fraud, and I think we addressed that in our last meeting, that the fraudulent element is going to be eliminated because they're going to have sort of like a electronic thing on it so that it can be read by the police. And I'm sure that's right, isn't it?
Ms Mulholland.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just say that we have been working with the multi-agency group, and we're looking at a 10 top tips for blue badge holders to try and distill the information down. We've also had Scottish Government marketing colleagues working with us. We have case studies from blue badge holders, and we're looking at a campaign near the time of the actual launch. So we know that we have to distill the messages down, just as we have done for road safety, and we've been very successful there, as the Minister has said. And also looking at what we used to call freebies, but apparently they now call objects for change, which are things that, everyday things like badge holders that have actual messages on them, so that they are simple, straightforward messages that people can understand, rather than a large booklet giving that information, so that it's clear to people what the rules and responsibilities are. So we are looking at distilling messages down. There is currently a DVD about the impact of the abuse of the scheme, and we're looking at, I think it's maybe already on YouTube. So we're looking at also that DVD and putting into that the consequences of abusing the scheme, as well as the impacts. It's a pretty hard-hitting DVD when you see it, because it's people actually talking about the effects that the abuse has on them on a daily basis. And we can strengthen that by then also, as I say, adding on the enforcement. Going on to the point about the badge, it already has an indicator. I think Mr Catchlove said that last week, that although the photograph is face down, the indicator in the back will tell enforcement officers, if they have a smartphone or a handheld device, right away what the circumstances of the badge holder are. And also, if they don't have the handhelds, if they haven't got that equipment, they can phone the back office. And we've also, after last week's evidence, been in contact with the police to see if they can also have direct access to that information. So we're talking to the people who produce the badges, Northgate Systems, to try to gain them that access too.
Mr Buchanan.
Can I just come back? The photograph is virtually meaningless in the sense that you don't see the photograph, and also when somebody else is driving you, it's not their photograph that's on it, it's mine in this case. And if somebody was driving me, I just got my licence back a few months ago, so I was finding that I was being driven all over by various different people, but it was my photograph on the blue badge. And if I wasn't in the car at the time because I was out at the doctor's or shopping or whatever it was like that, even for a minute or two, it could well have been, I suppose, it's open to abuse. So I don't think the photograph is so important as the electronic tag.
That's right. So there's actually a chip on the badge which gives the information of the badge holder.
Thank you very much.
In terms of the YouTube video and the various other bits that you've mentioned, including the top tips, are these new things which have come into play since the launch of Dennis's proposed bill? I know that you have been round the country with Dennis talking to various folks. Are these tips that have come from folks as you've been about?
He was already in existence because of the former reform process, but the idea to put it onto YouTube and to strengthen it with the new powers has come as a result of the bill and the 10 top tips. And it's actually been the working groups themselves, as we've been discussing things with them, who have raised the issue about awareness and about the distillation of information, making it much simpler. So through that conversation that we've been having with its local authorities, its representative groups on the working groups, who have been giving us that feedback, that we need to make sure that badge holders themselves are aware of their responsibilities, and that the wider community is aware of the impact of the abuse on the badge holders themselves.
Mr Robertson, do you have anything to add to anything that's been said by Ms Mulholland?
No, I don't think so. I think, Convener, it's been well covered.
Okay, thank you. John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. One of the issues that's been raised by the Minister is that, and he gave a figure earlier, that fraudulent misuse of the blue badge could be a saving to the user of that blue badge of up to £6,000. Do you think the penalties that are currently in place for fraudulent misuse of blue badge are high enough?
Minister?
Well, I think it's what we've identified, and I think what Dennis has identified, is the fact that the main, one of the main inhibitions on people actually undertaking the fraudulent activity is really, first of all, perhaps societal pressure on making them realise how unacceptable it is, but also the fact that there's a chance they're going to be caught. So I think those things are better deterrents than increasingly higher fines. I think those are the things which will make the difference, and that seems to be the feedback which we've had so far. And I think if you kind of ratchet up the various measures, so if you have, first of all, badges which are hard to counterfeit, if you have a database which allows you to verify it in the way that John Mulholland just described, and if you go further than that and say that it's actually an offence to have to use a cancelled badge inappropriately, that's actually an offence where it currently isn't the case. And also if you have the potential for non-uniform personnel to undertake investigations and to undertake work in enforcement, I think those elements of enforcement are a better disincentive to fraud than increasing fines. But I don't know if you've got a view on that, Dennis.
No, I think the Minister's absolutely right, and I think the fine in itself, although it's £1,000, I think we're looking at prevention here at the end of the day, and we're trying to sort of reduce the amount of fraud. So I think the Minister's absolutely right.
Convener, the issue for me is that it's fine to do all the campaigning to make and raise awareness of the misuse of blue badges. We heard evidence last week, and we received further follow-up evidence in written format over the week in relation to the number of fraudulent or misuse of blue badge cars that have been towed away by local authorities. And clearly, in the written evidence, they suggested that people were quite happy to pay the tow-away fine and just take their car away again. At what stage, if the public awareness campaign fails to get that message over? Because, as you said, Minister, the financial incentive for somebody to misuse or abuse a blue badge can be up to £6,000 a year. If you multiply that, if they're doing it over a number of years, the risk of being even up to £1,000 fine if they get caught may actually seem irrelevant in terms of what they may have saved by the abuse of the blue badge over a period of time.
Minister?
Yeah, I suppose trying to put myself into the mind of a criminal in this way, I would suggest that they make the calculation based not just on the potential financial penalty, but the likelihood of having to pay that penalty. And I think that's what we're trying to address here. Just now, there may be a feeling that because of the absence of some of these measures in Dennis's bill, there's a much greater chance of, if you like, getting away with it. I'm not sure. I'd have to ask Edinburgh City Council, for example, what their experience was of coordinated abuse. And the way I think you're trying to describe it, it becomes financially very attractive to have that level of abuse over a period of time. However, Edinburgh does have some pretty assiduous enforcement measures in place already, I think, as most of us have tried to park in the city would attest. So I think the calculation is not just, it may well be that somebody says, well, it's fair enough, I can pay £200–300 to recover my car, I can possibly pay a potential fine. I think if there were to be somebody that did that on a repeated basis and was caught, then it would always be the maximum fine I would imagine the courts would want to levy, because they're trying to discourage that repeat behaviour. But I think it's much more to do with the enforcement of it and also the social unacceptability of it. People that know about somebody else abusing the system feeling more confidence in coming forward and telling the authorities that this has been abused. So I think that's right. I think it has to be proportionate. I think so. I don't think for that reason, despite the fact I do agree with the point that you could see it's financially advantageous to take the risk. I think what this tries to do is to make the risk much greater, because there's much more likelihood of being caught.
Yes, Convener. I think with the design of the new badge in itself, and with the information that will be held within the badge, within the chip, and the ability to read that, again, will be a deterrent. The new badge came out in September 2012. And I think basically, if you look at it's an issue for 3 years. People with the old style badges, those old style badges will be away by 2015. So the new badges in itself will make it much more difficult for someone to actually abuse the system. And I think the enforcement officers will be able to detect that. And if there, as Mr Cashler said last week, basically when he's doing an undercover type operation, looking at that, he's gathering the evidence. So I think, you know, it's the new badge is going to give him that information. And if a person's getting out the car and they're saying they're mid-20s or whatever, and the badge is issued to someone in their 80s, then I think there's a case there for the confiscation, and that will make it much easier, as I say, with the new badge. So I can see it decreasing.
Just as a follow-up, and just to paraphrase Cameron Buchanan, Westminster is completely different from Scotland, not just in terms of the blue badge parking restrictions, but that's another debate for another day. In relation to the comments that were made, particularly by Mr Robertson, in terms of the parking restrictions that apply, you know, the yellow and double yellow line parking, how do we get the message over to blue badge holders that there may also be other restrictions contained? Because I know a number of years ago, someone very close to me who has a blue badge parked in a street in Glasgow on a yellow line, only to find when they went back to their car after 4:30 they received a ticket because there was a parking restriction on a sign, a small 6x4 sign at the side of the road, saying that they weren't allowed to park between 4:30 and 6 o'clock in that particular street. How do we get that message over to ensure that blue badge holders, who are genuine blue badge holders, are not being penalised because local authorities either failed to display properly the restrictions that are in place in the local authority, or because we know that blue badge holders don't restrict themselves to the village or the town that they live in. They do travel elsewhere, and quite rightly so. So is there a message there to local authorities to try and ensure that they get a proper signage in place to ensure that blue badge holders, genuine blue badge holders, are protected against unnecessary parking fines?
Mr Robertson, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, Convener, I think Mr Wilson makes a very valid point, and I think it is about ensuring that the appropriate signage is there and is extremely visible and not confusing, because certainly some of the evidence we've heard in the past is that some of the signage, although perhaps visible, can actually be very confusing. So there is a job for the local authorities to do to ensure that any signage with restriction of parking is there. But can I say to Mr Wilson that really, if there's a restriction there and it's yellow lines, you know, the same applies to the blue badge holder as it does to any other person in terms of parking restrictions. The concession is for or within the limits and the scope of that concession. You know, and if a person is given a parking ticket for indeed a parking abuse out with their concession, then that's what the consequences are.
Well, just to say, I think the restrictions which would apply tend to be in terms of safety, sometimes access as well, and these are important considerations for the safety of the blue badge holder as well, not parking in a place where they could cause either accidents or where they can inhibit legitimate access or very important access. So I think they are restricted. But yes, we would want to encourage local authorities, as we're obliged to do for the trunk road network, to make sure the signage was clear so that people understood the restrictions, especially if they have that preconception that with a blue badge that they have dispensation. So I think it's right to say it should be made clear to people.
Ms Grant, you were wanting to come in. I think it was maybe on the previous point. I'm sorry, you caught my eye right at the end.
To go back to Mr Wilson's point about the effect of a £1,000 fine, actually it's probably a bit more than that, because the person then receives a criminal conviction. It's a bit like drink driving. It's the longer term impact of having that conviction. There was a case in London last year where a lady had paid £500 for a fraudulent badge. She was investigated and used that badge, spotted using that badge over a period of weeks. Now, for example, in London, she's saving a lot in parking. She was prosecuted and fined £1,500 or £1,000, whatever the fine was down there. But as she worked for a bank, she then put her livelihood in jeopardy, because she had abused trust and things. So the wider impact for her and probably her family of trying to get free parking was much wider than just without, the fine that was imposed. So there is that angle to look, that aspect to look at.
Given Ms Grant's raised the issue about the fines and the criminal record that comes along with that fine, does the Scottish Government hold any figures in relation to the number of cases where people have actually been fined, taken to court and fined for abusive or misuse of Blue Badge?
We don't have that central information. We do even the estimate of the number of people we believe to be involved in fraudulent activity is an extrapolation from UK figures. So, because these things are determined locally, we don't have that very set of figures. Am I right in saying that, John? Yeah.
Mark MacDonald, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. At our last meeting, there were some concerns raised around the ability of non-uniformed officials to undertake enforcement action, and the view certainly from one of our witnesses representing a disability organisation was that this might present difficulties for those who are often vulnerable individuals who may not consider somebody who is not in a uniform to be somebody who would be undertaking enforcement. Can you maybe give some information, Mr Robertson, as to where you were coming from in terms of including that provision?
Thank you, Mr MacDonald. Convener, the aspect of a non-uniform person approaching someone is one that Inclusion Scotland feel that would be an area where a lot of people with disabilities may be disadvantaged. I don't share their concern, nor does a range of other disability organisations share Inclusion Scotland's concern. I think having a uniform or not is not really the issue. The ability to be able to identify yourself on the approach with appropriate identification is something that I think is appropriate. And indeed, Convener, I'm going to say that sometimes maybe being approached by someone in uniform can maybe raise even more anxiety among some of the vulnerable groups. And I think one of the issues and one of the examples that Inclusion Scotland gave was that people with maybe cognitive or, for instance, sensory impairments may have, they will no doubt have a third party with them. So again, there will be someone with the person, I suspect, when the ID is being produced. So I don't see it as an issue, to be perfectly honest.
Yes, sir.
I'll just agree with what Dennis has said. We've had quite a number of discussions about this, and I think the point that Dennis makes about other groups are very supportive of this because they see it as a key element in reducing abuse.
I'm grateful to the member for outlining that, the reasoning. In terms of one of the other issues that came up was around the confiscation element, and the point has been made that often a blue badge can be being abused without the knowledge of the person who holds the blue badge, and confiscation can then result in difficulties being caused to the holder of the blue badge as a consequence of that. I just wonder if you've looked into that as part of the confiscation powers and what your expectation would be in terms of how local authorities ought to deal with those kind of situations.
Yes, Convener, we have indeed, and certainly the working groups have been looking at that in great detail. We think it's an appropriate action that we're proposing within the aspect of the bill and the guidance that will be within the bill. And badges that are confiscated, Mr MacDonald, will be returned as quickly as possible to the badge holder. What we're trying to ensure is that badges that are being misused by a third party are returned to the badge holder as quickly as possible. And a person misusing a badge on street parking is denying access to another badge holder, a legitimate badge holder, actually having a parking space. So although, and again I believe it was Inclusion Scotland convener that felt that this was disadvantaging the badge holder, the badge holder is being disadvantaged anyway by that third party misuse of their badge. So the badge will be returned as quickly as possible with a letter explaining that the badge was withdrawn and is being returned. But again, it will reinforce the aspects of using the blue badge appropriately. And there'll be a reminder about the rules with regard to that badge being used. I hope that answers Mr MacDonald's question.
One of the points that was raised previously as well was around the number of convictions or prosecutions rather that would arise, and I think we had figures from Police Scotland at the last meeting that the number of cases passed for prosecution were quite low. I wonder if you would agree with me, though, Mr Robertson, that perhaps we ought not to measure the success of this legislation based on the number of prosecutions that take place or the cases that are passed for prosecution, because, of course, one of the things that you are trying to do through this legislation is to affect behaviour and modify behaviour, and the hope would be that the abuse of blue badge schemes would reduce as a result of people being aware of this legislation being in place, and that might help in terms of reducing the number of prosecutions that were required.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the member convener that it's about trying to ensure that it's prevention rather than anything else. And again, if we actually ensure that blue badges are being used appropriately, that is to the good of the blue badge community that are out there trying to use their badges and trying to get parking spaces. Misuse is a real problem, and I don't think the conviction rate is particularly high. But as I say, if we can get the awareness out there, the education out there, that is good and well, and I think we will see a significant difference, I think, in the reduction of the badges being misused.
Mr McMillan, please.
Just a couple of questions regarding the role of the non-uniformed enforcement officers. The first one is just regarding the level of training. What level of training do you see as being required for those who are non-uniformed to participate in the activity of enforcement?
Minister, do you want to go first?
Well, I think it will be different, I think, in different areas, although obviously some fundamentals will remain the same. But local authorities, as you'll know, undertake training for their staff in all sorts of areas just now. We believe that this is something that they can readily do, whether it's by adding this training on to other training which has been undertaken, or by covering it through customer service and other areas as well. But I think perhaps the most fundamental part of it is having to deal with people in a difficult situation in a non-confrontational matter, and local authority staff, a vast number of local authority staff have to do that on a daily basis. So we think this is within the current training kind of environment which local authorities are involved in any event. As I say, not all local authorities might want to go ahead with non-uniformed officers, but we think it's best left to them and doesn't present a huge problem for them. But we are working with a multi-agency working group, as you've heard, to develop guidance as a result of the bill for inclusion in training. So just going back to the earlier points that have been made about making sure the information that we have is readily understood by the public, well, the same is true. Perhaps those involved in local authority training might have to go through the bigger booklet and go through that, but I think we have to make sure that we provide the right tools for them, but they can take on the job.
Sir Robertson.
Convener, I think the Minister's absolutely right. The training already exists, and I think we're looking at areas of whether it be parking attendants or non-uniformed people making an approach. It's a non-confrontational aspect, and again, we would ask them just to use the appropriate caution. And we're not expecting people to be overzealous in the approach, as I think was suggested by maybe some of the user groups, some of the third-party organisations. I don't anticipate that will be the case at all. And I think that the training is there. I think it's appropriate, and raising the awareness is key to this whole the whole aspect of a successful enforcement of the blue badge.
Did you anticipate the use of community wardens across Scotland to actually be to have additional training to incorporate that into the role that they currently undertake?
Again, that would be entirely up to each local authority convener as to how they wish to exercise the powers that we're actually proposing within the bill.
The final question, if I may, it's just regarding the issue of the plain clothes, the enforcement officers. I mean, we had some discussion centring around this last week. And I mean, what role would you actually see that the plainclothes enforcement officers actually undertake?
Well, I think it's about just using the appropriate enforcement powers that are there. And I think, if they're there and plainclothes actually do witness, and I think Mr Cashlaw was actually suggesting that they could be used in terms of intelligence gathering. But again, Convener, I just got to sort of emphasise that it is entirely up to each local authority as to how they wish to use the powers that we're actually putting forward within this bill.
Convener, can I just add a short point to that, to say that I think they could also be involved, I think as Dennis is suggesting, in longer term investigations and building up a picture of what's going on, especially if going back to the point made previously by John Wilson about possibly considered and measured and calculated abuse of the system. I think that's where they could really come into their own, undertaking that longer term investigation. And then of course the benefit of being non-uniformed is really quite obvious, because they can undertake that in a discreet way.
Just a brief supplementary, Convener, in terms of Mr Robertson's last response in relation to the interpretation of the regulations that will be put forward for local authorities. If I picked up correctly, Mr Robertson, you indicated that it would be up to local authorities to interpret and how they used those powers. Would it not be better that we actually had a guidance that was issued that said they should apply these powers equally across Scotland? Because blue badge holders, as I said earlier, do not just restrict themselves to their own village, town or city. They actually move around, and there may be conflict in relation to how the regulations are applied in one local authority compared to a neighbouring local authority such as Aberdeenshire or Aberdeen.
Mr Robertson.
Convener, I think Mr Wilson, what I'm suggesting is that the legislation framework will be there and the guidance will be there, and it will be very clear. But what I'm saying in terms of the powers, the legislation within here and the enhancement is actually powers and not a duty. So local authorities themselves have to exercise their own judgment as to whether they apply them.
I appreciate that point, but perhaps more for the Minister, but also Mr Robertson. But I was at the Celtic Community Council last month, and so was the police, and the issue came up, and it was just when John was talking about the parking restrictions, the issue came up. There's a ongoing problem in Celtic around cars parking at the cross, not into the bookies, and it's an ongoing problem, but the issue was raised yet again because there's yellow lines there, and two questions arise for that. Firstly, the point was being made by community councillors that the police were driving past and not doing anything about that, and they had made the point that in 5 parking's decriminalised, the local authority has responsibility. But so my first question would be to confirm that the police do have a responsibility and are able to act where they see illegal parking. And that then brings me on to my second point, which was the point was made by the police that it could be blue badge holders that are parked on the yellow lines. And it's that question of restrictions, and blue badge holders can park on yellow lines, but who would deem whether they were parking in a dangerous position? For example, Celtic Cross, where the reason the yellow lines is there is because you come round the crossing if there's parking. So who actually determines that? And is that for the police? And within the bill, is that something that the parking attendants, the local authority attendants, would also pick up?
Minister?
Yes, first of all, the answer to the first question is yes, absolutely. The police have the powers and the responsibility to ensure the law is observed, and that continues regardless of whether DPE is taking effect in a local authority area. But they make a judgment on when to enforce that, and I think, I live quite close to Kelty, but I can also say I've never been to the bookies at Kelty Cross. But it would depend on how dangerous, I suppose, they felt it was. I'm not familiar with. Honestly, I'm not familiar with that particular road layout, but it would depend whether it was deemed to be dangerous as to whether, I suppose, it prompted them to take action when otherwise they wouldn't do that. And I would say in relation to the restrictions, the restrictions, for people to obey restrictions, they have to be aware of what they are, obviously. And in that circumstance, if the local authority have put restrictions around parking there, and if they also apply to blue badge holders because of, as I've said before, perhaps access and egress or because of safety, then people should know about that. So blue badge holders, as much as anybody else, have to understand what the restrictions are. If those restrictions don't apply, then the blue badge holder is perfectly entitled to park on both single yellow lines and double yellow lines. And who would take responsibility if the police are not there? Well, that again would be a matter for Fife Council in this case to say, well, we think there's a sufficient problem here. We think we can address this by the use of non-uniformed employees taking up this issue, obviously not just for Kelty but throughout Fife, so they would have that remedy. And to come back to the point that John Wilson made, I very much believe, certainly from my time in local authorities, we should, wherever possible, leave the discretion in these areas with local authorities. Of course, the powers have to be the same across the land, and that will be the case. But the way that local authorities deal with it, as we're seeing with DPE, they're taking the decision, decriminalise parking enforcement. It's them that should take the decision, and I think that's the right way to do it. So if they perceive a particular problem at Kelty Cross and other areas as well, where they think it's worth them having non-uniformed employees working on that, then they can take the decision to do that. However, if they are doing that, if there are restrictions which are in place there, then it's going back to the previous point again made by John Wilson. It's right that they should make that very clear to people. So blue badge holders should know that even though they can otherwise park on double yellow lines or single yellow lines, in that case they can't because of these restrictions for reasons of safety or otherwise.
Cameron Buchanan, please.
One very quick point. It just occurred to me that these rules and instructions that should be on one sheet of paper, could they not be laminated at the same time as and they go out at the same time as the blue badge? So you've got, because the problem with a piece of paper is it gets lost. If it's laminated and it's on one sheet of paper, it's just an idea for the actual bullet points we're going to have, and keep it simple. That's all. Thank you.
Very good practical ideas, and we undertake to look at those suggestions. Kavina.
In terms of Ms Mulholland's answer earlier, the working group are looking at a huge amount of these things, and it seems things have cracked on apace since the start of the consultation on the bill. I'm sure that you'll be taking note of these points, Ms Mulholland. Would I be right in thinking so? Yes, thank you very much. If I can maybe finish off with one final question round about the Law Society and their evidence last week, and they expressed concerns about the absence of a procedure for appealing a local authority's internal decision to a sheriff. They believed it was not compliant with Article 6. Do you have any comments on that, gentlemen? Minister, maybe first.
Well, first of all, obviously I saw the remarks that were made last week. We've had a discussion with legal officers in the Scottish Government as well, who are of the firm view that this does not breach the article mentioned, and it is compliant with ECHR. I mean, over and above that, I would say we have been concerned to ensure there is the appeal process, which has been mentioned previously, which happens independently of the person that took the first decision, but still within the authority. But of course there are other forms of redress as well. We have the local authority ombudsman, and of course there's a legal remedy as well, judicial review. So I think that the remedies are there, and the information and the advice that we have is compliant with ECHR. And given this is the last question, I'll just raise one other point briefly, Convener, to Mark MacDonald's previous question about, and I think he's absolutely right to say we shouldn't judge the success of this if we get this bill passed and Dennis's bill is passed by the Parliament on the level of convictions. In fact, you could actually say a lower level of convictions would be a mark of success, but you would have to guess at that. I think what we should be doing is looking at how the current situation where 52% of people feel, of users, believe the system has been abused. I think it's that level that we have to try and see if we can drive down. So if you go back out and survey people again and they say it's a much lower number, that will be, I think, the mark of success rather than a conviction rate. Thanks.
Mentioning the legal points there, he was looking at you, Mr Feibister. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah. I think the Law Society's point was, frankly, misconceived. They mixed up the availability of judicial review with its cost. The availability of judicial review provides the Article 6 compatibility. What is done by the bill reflects that judicial review isn't a cheap or terribly user-friendly procedure, and we're putting in a rather simpler internal review procedure.
Thank you. Mr Robertson, leave the last word to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think with reference to the process of applying and an appropriate review, the criteria remains the same, Convener. So at the end of the day, with the independent mobility assessment, which came in 2012, that's following a strict criteria with regard to the guidance. If a person's application is denied, they can, within the scope of this bill, they can now actually go and request a review of that decision, and that will be done, again, within the local authority, but it will be done with a different sort of line management, and they will look over the whole aspect. But they will be following the guidance and criteria, so there will be no need for it to go external at all. And again, in terms of the cost, these costs will just be borne, I think, within the local authority themselves. And we don't envisage any real significant cost in terms of reviews that are envisaged. But I think it's, as I say, the proposal, convener, is to try and ensure that those who have a blue badge are being able to use it appropriately, and those who apply for a blue badge get it on the grounds of meeting the criteria.
Thank you very much for your evidence today. I suspend for a couple of minutes to allow the witnesses to leave. Thank you. We overheard that. Can we? Let's get this out of the way. Agenda item 2 is subordinate legislation. We're looking at the consideration of 2 negative instruments. Members have a paper from the clerk setting out the purposes of each of these instruments, which includes comments from the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. The first instrument is the Ethical Standards in Public Life, etc. Scotland Act 2000, Register of Interests Amendment Regulations SSI 2014/50. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee have drawn our attention to the defective drafting of Regulation 4 of this instrument. The Scottish Government have accepted an omission in the drafting, but have assessed that the drafting error can be highlighted during the process of approving new codes of conduct under Section 3. Do members have any comments to make on this instrument? Are we agreed not to make any recommendation to the Parliament on this instrument? Thank you very much. The second instrument this morning is the Town and Country Planning Hazardous Substance Scotland Amendment Regulations 2014, SSI 2014/51. This instrument refers to the control of major accident hazards involving dangerous substances and the insertion of heavy fuel oils to that list of hazardous substances. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee have drawn to our attention a relatively short delay in implementing Article 30 of the directive. Our attention is also drawn to the transitional provisions required to cover a person who does not presently need hazardous substance consent. Sorry about this, folks. Now requiring consent immediately as from 29th of March 2014. The Scottish Government acknowledged the small delay due to competing resource pressures within the Policy Department. They also assess it as unlikely many sites will be affected by the transitional exemption. Do members have any comments to make on this instrument? Are we agreed not to make any recommendations to the Parliament on this instrument? Thank you very much. As agreed, we now move into private session and I suspend. Thank you.